Hi everyone. Happy Monday. Happy start of the week. We just had Mid-Autumn Festival, Autumn Equinox. We are at a point of balance before we head into the rest of autumn. My name's June Lynn Go. I'm one of the co-founding directors of Migrants in Culture. And this is our first autumn talk as part of Saturday School, which is a creative lab for migrant organizers to imagine, embody, and design for border abolition. So Saturday School is rooted in the recognition that as we campaign and organize to mitigate harm from multiple hostile environments, we also need to be designing and building the community infrastructures, economies, and relationships that we want, that replace borders, that more compellingly demonstrate that borders are in fact unnecessary. So these infrastructures, economies, and relationships require us to get good at experimenting, learning and resourcing our experiments, and sustaining long-term experimentation. This is really, really hard work. So over the next week, we're talking to Civic Square, Decolonizing Economics, and a member of Interrupting Criminalization to ask, how do we experiment? How do we hold long and bold visions whilst building our futures brick by brick in the present? And today we're going to begin with Daniel Blyden. So it's a super privilege and honor to be speaking with you, Daniel. Daniel is the co-founder and director of design at Civic Square, which is demonstrating neighborhood-scale civic infrastructure for social and ecological transition, together with many people and partners in Ladywood, Birmingham, UK. Daniel is a designer, a design facilitator, and a creative producer interested in the role of design in leadership and building design capacity in people and organizations. So we're going to have a conversation. Like I said before, Daniel has the, Daniel has just my face to look at, not everyone else's beautiful faces for the next 45 minutes or so. And then we'll have some time for questions. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask Daniel, please drop them into the Q&A function and we'll get to them at the end of the conversation. How are you, Daniel?
Hey, Julian. I'm good, thank you. Just, I guess, preparing myself for these longer nights and shorter days.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, let's get into it, Daniel. Um, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the work
Yeah.
and what your journey was to Civic Square?
Yeah. I guess my journey in sort of design started um from a young age, but then also I guess really I started in visual design for communications, storytelling, um, telling stories of things that are going on in my community, creatives, and really started after my undergraduate degree in university. I'd grown up, I'm a child of this city, Birmingham, and a son of African Caribbean migrants who came to the UK in the Windrush generation. My parents were born here. I was born here. My grandparents are from the Caribbean, Jamaica, and Montserrat, the smaller islands, some of the smaller islands in the Caribbean. And so I carry a lot of that heritage and culture in um just where I'm situated now. And so I guess coming from such a background, my creativity and stepping out into that in sort of the areas that I'm in now, I feel like we're not as represented in the spaces that I am in. And so I often feel a sense of privilege, but also a responsibility to some of that. And not often thinking about that. But yeah, my journey with starting with visual design communications really was in the creative sector in Birmingham a lot, really. And I built a lot of relationships and networks and community here. And then I started to work in higher education a little while after I finished my graduate degree, undergrad, and was doing sort of creative communications for a university in Birmingham. And then a couple of years into that, I started to think about, because my whole thing was like I wanted to apply my creative skills and abilities and to things that I felt were meaningful. I didn't want to go down the route of like very commercial sort of advertising, and at the time that was how I was thinking. That's all you kind of saw creative outlets going into in terms of actually being able to sustain a living, was to go and work in sort of like maybe PR and marketing or advertising and things like that. And I kind of resisted this and felt like I wanted to do things that I felt were more meaningful, and ended up in education because I felt like there was something around the educational institutions and universities that were about human flourishing and just being in that space. I felt that was um, somewhere I could apply my creativity. And I guess working in an institution at that time, an institution of the social order, I guess it was very, I was able to do some really cool things at the time, but then after a while it became very stagnant and very slow and very sometimes boring, mundane. And I found a course in digital management at the time, as it was called, but underpinning that was like a lot of design thinking and design-led innovation, learning methods. A school called Hyper Island in Manchester. I went and did a master's degree there in 2015. And there I kind of discovered and kind of learned how much, really kind of recognized how much society was changing, how much kind of on a really deep fundamental level, we're seeing a lot of uncertainty in institutions that people felt secure in society, not just locally but globally. A lot of things to do with, like, at the time, digital transformation and the disruption that was caused through digital technology and so forth. And just like the volatility and kind of complexity of the times and all of those things, became more conscious of that. And then the role of the artist or the creative or the designer to reimagine some of those things or hold space for that. And so I became aware of the practice of a designer being involved in sort of working with people's innate creativity to generate new possibilities, and really became more interested in like holding space as a designer and working more collaboratively with collaborative design methods, and um yeah, just like not centering an individual designer in that way. I became like aware that this was happening in lots of spaces and places, and there's different methods and tools of doing this through studying that course. And then at the end of it, which was around 2015 time, I I wanted to go back to Birmingham and kind of experiment with some of these methods and processes in my community. That had a lot of relationships and networks already. And at the time, uh, it was the beginning of the space Impact Hub Birmingham, which was the predecessor of Civic Square. It just raised a huge amount of money on Kickstarter, and we're opening this space. And I landed back in the city after 6 months away and learned about what they were looking to do there, and a lot of the stories they were sharing about like the um how the city doesn't represent its people in terms of the leadership and who gets to work in sort of these creative spaces, and who owns the land, who's yeah, who's prospering, who's not, and all of those sort of questions of justice and fairness and equality were being asked, and the journey of many people who have from all sorts of walks of life coming together in a space to grapple with some of these questions about the city. That was all happening or starting or bubbling up in this space in Impact Hub in Birmingham. And I kind of, through doing my master's research at the time, found a bit of a home there, just amongst the community there, and started to host something called the Global Jams, Global Design Jams, which you may have heard of, are all around the world. They kind of 48-hour co-creation, co-design, design thinking experiments, basically bringing people together to collaboratively access their creativity and reimagine things. And I started to host those in Birmingham at Impact Hub, and some of the methodologies that I'd learned in my master's, and making these as open spaces for people to come to, started to run this whilst also doing freelance consultancy in partnership with a friend that I finished my course with. At the time, we were called Spaghetti Labs because we were looking at innovation as like really the connection of knowledge and the networks and the spaghetti of this. That was the where I was at that time. And then I found my way into the work that we're doing now because after a couple of years, joined the team more officially at Impact Hub, because I'd been working on some projects that we've been doing as part of that community. So for those who don't know, Impact Hub was a collaborative workspace. But in Birmingham, we really thought about it as this experimentation for the town hall of the 21st century, looking at where the spaces that people come together, dream, reason, kind of play, explore, learn, all these things in the same sort of space in order to respond to the challenges that we face, the complex challenges that require collaboration across multiple people, entities, organizations, beyond the individual or the silver bullet or the one startup solution to these challenges. So at that time, they were a co-working space built out of a community of people who were convening around TEDx and ideas for our futures. And we started to look at some of the systemic challenges that the city faces. And one of the projects that I was really involved in at the time was called Radical Childcare, which was looking at the outcomes for children and families in the city, and how we could look at where to invest differently by bringing together multiple people from different spectrum parts of society, from the built environment through to employers, to families and children, childcare workers, and exploring these issues. So we looked at childcare, and we looked at housing, and we looked at like kind of creativity and leadership, and art, how artists are at the forefront of change and changes in the city. And I think sort of halfway through that journey, we were it was all kind of, at the time, revenue was self-generated through events and hiring the space out for events and memberships, and also doing projects. But we didn't at the time receive like funding as such. But we knew that longer term it wouldn't be sustainable in that part of the city because of the rapid development and regeneration and gentrification as a result taking place in that part of the city. And the rents would be extortionate, and different challenges that would mean that it wouldn't really be viable longer term there. And then also just the application of the big ideas that we were exploring. How do you actually start to demonstrate those at some kind of scale was a question when people are coming from lots of different places and things. And those were some of the early beginnings of the idea of Civic Square, because all of the research and the thinking that we were doing started to get like kind of synthesized into this idea of Civic Square, but more working at a neighborhood scale and thinking about systemic challenges at a neighborhood scale. And So yeah, fast forward to sort of 2020 is when we closed, no, 2019, we closed the Impact Hub Birmingham and refounded a Civic Square starting in 2020 in another part of the city, Ladywood. And that was a vision that we started to craft halfway through the time we were open at Impact Hub, visualizing kind of just what we wanted to create in terms of neighborhood scale infrastructure. We had conversations with a developer who was putting out a vision for neighborhoods of the future from their perspective on a site that had been, it's a post-industrial site in the city, and they want to build new homes and retrofit, well, actually not retrofit, they wanted to redevelop these big post-industrial buildings into kind of they called it a cultural hub at the time. And we put a vision forward for Civic Square on these buildings to basically take them over and turn them into this physical infrastructure for the neighborhood. And so that's what we've been working towards since 2020 as a team at Civic Square. And so my role within that has been a lot around in these first 5 years of Civic Square, kind of neighborhood participation, learning, co-design, and how we kind of reimagine our possibilities as a neighborhood in that everyday context. And often it's about like socializing ideas around regenerative futures, regenerative economics, using frameworks like donut economics and lots of decolonial approaches to design, and how people are involved in the process of developing this space and feeling like they can access this, and really kind of how our futures can flourish in this kind of challenging sort of times of climate change and need for adaptation and so forth. So yeah, that's my kind of journey into this work.
It's so fascinating, and I love hearing people's journeys
Mm.
because we're threading so many passions and like chapters of our life together. They're never not useful. They're all being weaved into something so unique that only we could do. And
Yeah.
I just love how you've spoken about the human flourishing, the role of the artist and designer
Mm.
in innovation, and the need to find a home and apply some of that thinking.
Mm.
It's just really just so wonderful how you kind of weave that together, um, from the design jams to, a city hall for the 21st century to
Mm.
now, Civic Square, and demonstrating so much in a neighborhood setting that is systematic.
Mm.
Um, because so I think a lot of us are on this call now because we are all experimenting and doing something that feels quite new and maybe unknown territory.
Mm.
And I think, when you did that master's and you learnt some design framing,
Mm.
and saw different possibilities through design framing. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about, as a designer, how you approach design, particularly in a time of multiple crises, polycrisis, like
Mm.
multiple hostile environments. How are you holding that? How do you approach design in the reality we're in?
Mm. Yeah, I loved that question when you shared that question, because it just got me thinking again, because I came across this term polycrisis a few years ago and it fascinated me. Um, even though it's like it's kind of an old term, this idea that we're facing like these multiple entangled crises, and they're kind of playing out and unfolding at different speeds and scales and rates and things. And Yeah, I think really it's just it just further in it further showed to us the need to kind of tap into our imaginations and reimagine these systems that we find ourselves as a part of. And I think at Civic Square, there's like a range of different principles that we're currently working with, but we've refined them recently in like moving towards, because the first sort of 5 years of this work has been really about building trust and relationships in the neighborhood, having moved from one part of the city to here, building trust relationships to then build has been like a long journey, and to there's a big ways we've tried to invest in that, so that we don't, like, with these big ideas, thinking around like our economic futures, we don't alienate people, that people own these ideas as their own or interpret them in their own sort of ways. Providing the space and the resources and the abilities to get to grips to that has been like a big part of the work in the last 5 years, and to where we are now in actually moving next year into all being well, um, um, starting some actual building work and creating and making some of this tangible. So there's a range of sort of principles that we're working with and designing with at this time, as we build this neighborhood public square, um, as we're calling it. And they're available on our open source of the neighborhood public square proposal. But I'll just share, like, I think there's 8 of them, but then I'll share one of the ones that I feel like my work has really aligned more to. So there's this idea of designing with the eco region, which is all about looking at our ecology and the systems of that, and how we're asking questions of that in our design processes, designing through reuse, which I think is kind of self-explanatory in a way. Like, obviously these times we need, in our material, where we find ourselves materially, like reusing is important. Designing for radical reimagination, which is the one that I think I will show a little bit more on. Designing to distribute, like how we don't centralize like resources, and it's that's I think adapted from a principle in donor economics, which is all about designing for distribution rather than centralization. Designing for neighborhood stewardship, so that's a lot about the governance and that being shared and owned between many. Designing for adaptability, designing for social and ecological regeneration, and design to demonstrate. And I say, you can read about some of these, and I'll probably share some links with you guys so you can follow up with people on the call. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, I wanted to kind of zoom in on the kind of designing for radical reimagination, because I think that's where I feel like a lot of the tangible work that I've been able to work on, well, it's tangible but intangible. Imagination is intangible, but yeah, because I think a lot of the work that I'm doing now and the last few years has really looked in on that, and it's just like, how do we create the conditions to look beyond that everyday challenges and status quo bias to imagine radical new futures for one another and our homes. And there's this quote in the article that's by a new European Bauhaus economy paper, which says, as we face up to material constraints, we'll need to discover new immaterial abundances. The degrowth of material energy and extraction could be accompanied by a growth in care, maintenance, participation, collective intelligence, new forms of logistics, and virtual, augmented, and other immaterial assets. To accomplish this will require investment in intangible immaterial structures. And that's this idea that, like, as our material constraints increase, we have an abundance and a wealth of immaterial, things like our imagination, things like how we care, things like how we reuse, and how we practice this together, and like how we tap into that in our everyday and see that as an abundance of value that we would never run out of, as humans, and seeing ourselves as caring, sociable, adaptable, and that we in communion with one another wouldn't run out of this resource, this idea. And so I think in terms of in my role, I'm responsible for a lot of everyday participation with people in the neighborhood, crafting, creating, holding learning experiences in the everyday and then also with the peers and partners we work with through your learning journeys and things. And I think for me, that intangibility is about really taking a really relational approach to design. So holding the spaces that move beyond, often in co-design participatory methods that are used by organizations and businesses. Like it's you come to a workshop and then you answer some questions, or you might do a co-creative activity to generate insights about something. And then from there, the person who's hosted that workshop will take that information and they'll do whatever they do with it. But then you don't hear anything else from those people that have been participating. And that becoming extractive, and the knowledge that's generated in those conversations and the connections and the imaginations of the people is never shared with them or held or owned by them. And so ways to move beyond this basically has been a lot of my thinking and practice, and in our work as well, like that people are owners of the knowledge that's generated in those processes. And so whenever we enter the dialogue and we're thinking about the relationships more than just the insights that are coming out, which is also where the value is often placed. So yeah, recognizing that these opportunities emerge from being in community with one another and never came from one individual person. And so from there we can build and create together. But I think for me, for years, this has caused me to be a bit existential about whether I can call myself a designer, because the idea of a designer being is like an individual that is like, yeah, it's individual, that's right. It's a heroic profession. Like you come up with the solutions and generate the answers, and the traditional narratives around design are based on this. And that's sometimes I have my moments where I might have a bit of genius, but it's generally because I've weaved things together from others, or it's very contextual. And so this is something I've just more recently looked at in more like, I guess, some academic language and for this sort of stuff. And a friend of mine in Montreal, Canada, shout out to Antonio Starnino, he's a service designer. He showed me an article on relational design by someone called Victor Udoa and Savannah Keith Gress. And it talks about a radical participatory design, which is exactly this, where it's all about being in relationship, and then what emerges from there, you build. And so by socializing all the knowledge and the big concepts and ideas and making it tangible in this everyday and really making space for that, I think over the last 5 years, it's been I think now we're kind of ripe for people to feel like they can contribute or own some of this, and like we do something differently in our neighborhood. But it requires you kind of investing in some of those just basic human things for people to feel a sense of trust, and like even just feeding people, and just sharing food, and sharing ideas in everyday spaces, and regularly doing this, or building things that are small, that like recognize we've done something together and affirm that, and people feeling comfortable together. Yeah. So I think that is my approach, if and the approach we're taking in Civic Square.
Wow. Yeah, wow, your answers are amazing, Daniel. Um, I think the principles that you shared are
Yeah.
so useful and can be applied in so many different contexts. I can see how it synthesized so many different lineages as well. of concern and thought and wisdom. And that point that you said about the existential crisis of being a designer, yes, you're talking to the right people here. I mean, all of us were artists, culture workers, and we just called ourselves a design agency because that's what a lot of migrant grassroots groups were asking for. So we just went, okay, you need a designer, we'll be your designer.
Yeah.
And that may be in terms of, I don't think we, I think we just got Adobe.
Yeah. Yeah.
We just walked out for Adobe so we can do some proper design. I know
Yeah.
Javi, our designers, are on the call now. And then in terms of this more like service design, I feel like all the artists, the socially engaged practice people, they can all relate to this crafting of space, this shaping of conditions for people to use their imagination to look beyond the status quo. But there's such different language
Mm.
around this. And I think, yeah, I guess in the design world, service design is the closest maybe. But it has a very like governmental, maybe more institutional kind of context. Um, yeah, but there's like you said, like how do we weave together all our skills, our expertise in making meaning of the of how we can apply our skills to to do something in the context we're in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is just like for us as like the often oppressed peoples that have been maybe disenfranchised from our lands or other things, like that agency to design has been taken away in many ways. So I feel like understanding what that is to design, but then realizing that we probably wouldn't go about it in this way if we were connected to our 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 knowledges of our ancestry and stuff. It's just interesting because I feel like yeah, what is innate to many of our communities, particularly of people of color, is like it is more collective and community um in communion with one another. But in order to operate in these Western systems, and we immerse ourselves in these languages, but then try and hack it into like how we would do it, kind of thing. Yeah,
Absolutely. It's like social acupuncture because there's been blockages created by colonial violence and
yeah,
so many centuries of misunderstanding or fracture in our lineages that
mm,
actually maybe that is also part of our role to not design the new solution but just to unblock what we already have innately in
yeah,
us,
yeah,
or collectively what we innately have in us and the
yeah,
relationships.
yeah, definitely. Mm,
I think, shall we, let's come back to refounding, but I think this flows really nicely
mm,
because of what, all the principles you were talking about and how you design space, how you convene space.
mm.
Um, Can you share some of your learning around what are the ingredients to convene people in a safe, supported, and resourced context to
Mm.
experiment, to rediscover, to reconnect?
Yeah, I think it starts with the invitation and just the many forms this can take. Um, yeah, and I think like one of the things that we've really taken seriously is like the framing of invitations and how people identify where they're at or see themselves in these spaces. But some of that also is it's not just in communications form in terms of like yeah, written or creative design. It's also in that relationship as well. it's embodied often as well. The invitations can be. So yeah, the art of the invitation is something that I think has been really serious since Impact Hub times. Um, but like I shout out to Bing, who is like one of the co-founders as well. Like she's like a mastercraft of invitations in terms of just like yeah, how they are produced and written and shared and stuff. And really we take that quite seriously and think about it at different scales, whether we're talking to our neighbors in that every day or we're putting something out into the wider ecosystem, peers, how we invite people. And then I think like how we make the space, we think about make the space equitable for people to participate in things. So for example, just if we know that there are structural economic blockers for people participating in certain things, then we try to put things in place that will help to alleviate some of that. I'm not saying we can fix it all, but we try to like make the spaces more equitable. So for example, if somebody is participating in something and they have a full-time job or their job sent them or their things like that, then you have to take that into account when you're inviting someone who is maybe unemployed or has to travel further to be involved in something, and how we put those sorts of things in place to remove the blockers. And then in terms of, I guess, making it kind of safe and feeling supported, hosting, like the art of hosting is also just something that's really deeply embedded in the work that we do, like just hospitality, um, like understanding some of the things that people might be carrying into spaces, or trying to maybe check in with where people are at when they're entering these spaces and just welcoming whatever it is and then helping them to put that into its right place to then be able to be a part of what is the purpose of our convening, whatever is our intentions. And yeah, I think physical space also plays a role in some of that, but that's one thing we've had to try to contend with a lot over this last 5 years, not having a physical space. So then the work it takes to make that space feel like it's welcoming and can hold the different things that people are bringing in. These are all things that I think we consider in creating a safe and supported environment, and just feeding people as well, like food is if you feel nourished, you can actually participate and you feel gifted as well.
Food is important, and I wouldn't say just any food. I think it's got to be hot food.
Yeah.
No sandwiches, please. I'm just looking at the time.
Yeah.
This time's gone by really quickly. There's two like really important questions I want to ask you, but I'm
Mm.
just going to take a pause here and ask anyone out there if you've got questions that you would like answered. Now's the time to kind of start thinking and putting them into the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask Daniel two questions to you, which I feel like we need to answer. Um, One is part of the reason why I wanted to get in touch with you was because Civic Square is so transparent with how they share progress and share their learnings. And in 2023, you refounded the organization and, published a paper on all your learnings.
Mm.
And I just wanted you to share, like, why was it important to refound organizations? And I think this is so vital as some of us sustain or inherit organizations with really long histories or organizations that are going through a lot of change. So why refound this
Mm.
organization?
Well, thanks for this question because I think it caused me to go back to what I did my master's research on, which was about institutional change and we found in institutions like, and just for the long and short of it is we had to refound because we had drifted quite, not drifted, we'd done a lot of the work that we had set out to do, but also there was a lot of things that took us far away from some of the fundamental things that we were there to do. Um, One was the pandemic and what that meant for us having to in the way we grew our team and like the way we were working. And there were so many things that needed to be reset in order for us to go back on track to what we were there to do, which was some of the physical buildings to be very, very present in the neighborhood. And having to work online and in this kind of like uncertain way for a while and recruiting people into that during that time meant that there was a lot of, I think, confusion and things that like, and practices and patterns of behavior that emerged out of like a time that wasn't what we were meant to be working in towards what we were trying to do, right? So 2023, I guess, was the first moment where I think 2022 was a really hard year for many, and I think we're all still dealing with the after effects of the global pandemic and things. But 2023, we actually were able to put a bit of a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're here for, and this is what we were here to demonstrate. And we reframed some of the ideas that strategically what we were there to do, which was like, it was where we came out with this framing around being systems demonstrators, which was moving from like doing these portfolios of experimentation to actually demonstrating in a place what we're up to and what we're trying to achieve. And really, it was about how our team realigned and reorganized around this idea of being system demonstrators and what that meant. And I think there was something that indeed Johar said that this is something that periodically organizations are going to have to think about doing in times of in these times of polycrisis and transition as well. And so that practice of being adaptable to just the context in which you're working in, and also looking internally about like what that means. Yeah, so that was the reasons for refounding, and I think there's a whole other story about how we went about doing that. I think there were certain like enablers and things that were like we almost like there's a shadow side to doing what we did because we we almost fell into a period where we weren't producing anything or we weren't doing anything because we were almost too insular and too introspective to then and then recognizing that you're on public money and doing that, you can't do that for too long and it becomes a privilege. So we were conscious of some of these things in our refounding process, and I think there were privileges that we had in being able to do some of these things, but we didn't have to do it in that way. We just could, so we did. Um, I think there's something about like, yeah, how you approach this that's really important if you're gonna think about refounding. Yeah, that's it.
Amazing. And I think just such great practice for us all to think we will need to refound as a natural course of what we do. Refounding is a very natural thing. When we start drifting away from our mission or vision, we need to come back to it somehow, or adapt it, or update it somehow.
Mm.
I think there's. Should we do one more? Do you think you can do the? Can we talk about the neighborhood stuff just really, really quickly?
Yeah, yeah,
I know
sure.
Sarah's got a really great question here as well, but maybe just quickly because I feel like this is so relevant to the audience that is here. Um, we last spoke about how a world without borders impacts the way that you think about community infrastructure of the future. I'm just wondering if you could give us a little taster of how you're thinking about border abolition as you build Civic Square.
Yeah, I think I was one of the things that we were quite wary about when we started to move from the city to the neighborhood scale is that like you can easily get caught up in like local politics of like who's in and who's out of certain spaces based on postcodes and borders that are written by political interests, and these change all the time as well. So during the time where we started to work in the area, um, the boundaries of different things changed and stuff like this. And so when you're asked who this physical space is for on a very basic level, like we talk about Ladywood, but in our area that can mean it can mean it can mean the ward in Birmingham because it's like wards, or it can mean a specific. It's how people imagine what that is as well. There's different contentions around those things, and how do we take those things into account when we're talking about um, who is here to serve and what this infrastructure is there to serve. So we started to use the 20-minute neighborhood model to think about um, who is kind of working with primarily, and that's 20 minutes, whether you can get there on foot or on a bike or um, in a car or on public transport, and what that and how people relate to the place. Do they live or reside within that 20 minutes? Do they come into that 20-minute area to work, or how do they relate to it? And servicing those different needs and how they desire to connect to this neighborhood. And we also have a design framework that we think about Civic Square through and what it is. It's all about bringing together these different design matters, which are we talk about the dark matter, which is the unseen things that influence the way we make decisions or what we're able to do and design. Things like legal structures, financial structures, governance models, um, all of these things that are decided before you're even in the room together that you don't actually see. That's the dark matter. Then you've got the dream matter, which is all about our imaginations, our hopes, our fears as people, and how we want to come together in a community. And then it's how you bring that together in the everyday, which is the physical spaces and tangible artifacts that we use to bring people together. How does the dream and the dark matter come together to inform those things? And so one example of how we communicated our neighborhood is an example of like combining the dream and the dark matter, in that we're looking at people's aspirations and hopes for a relationship with a neighborhood or place, the community, combined with what are the existing structures of the political boundaries and borders, and how are those decided and how can those be challenged and things like that, to talk about the neighborhood. So that that is like a short illustration of how we're thinking about borders and things in neighborhoods. Yeah.
Amazing. There are two questions that I can see from Pooja and Sarah. And it's the first bit of their questions are similar, but from a different angle.
Yeah.
Pooja's is about how do you navigate internalized colonial institutionalized thinking while attempting to create new orders of relationality. And the
Yeah.
first part of Sarah's is, have you come across particular non-Western design processes that you utilize in your work? So
Yeah.
there's a decolonizing of spaces whilst we're operating in colonized spaces, and
Yeah.
and design processes.
Yeah. Um, I guess that first question around decolonizing your kind of interior inner worlds and the organizations. I think there's like it's challenging. It's often you just gotta really try and challenge the scripts that we're given in terms of like how we're meant to relate to each other. Like I guess one of the really difficult one for me personally has been like going into operating as a business, as an organization, and like what comes with the relationships of having employees and the assumptions around like how you're supposed to perform in those environments and like how I'm supposed to be as a founder, as director with people who are working with us on this mission. Like one of the things in refounding the questions that we asked that really struck me was like, is the company as in the incorporated company the right model or mechanism to do this type of change? And it's like you constantly have to work with both of those things. When we were designing our governance and our initial kind of work, there's a piece of work called Black Party that we did in 2021, and it was all about redesigning our governance models. And one of the things that we kind of just recognized in that there's always these twin tracks of the system that exists and the system you're trying to create, and you have to operate in both. And we just accepted that and tried to use that to usher in the change, but also like we're still stuck in this system of having to sustain this work through these models of corporate company or like a incorporated company, and with that still have the employee employer dynamic, which is problematic sometimes, but also can be beneficial sometimes in terms of moving things forward. So I just say that to say it's a constant question, and you need to kind of been learning a lot about like just how to do that introspection, but not like see yourself as separate from the interdependencies. And we collectively did a course on the politics of, oh my gosh, um, Stacey Haynes,
Somatics.
mathematics, yeah, yeah, I've forgotten the name of the book now, and the course that we did, but basically like recognizing that when you're working through your inner stuff, it's not separate from those who you're in relationship with, and so practicing ways to be open about those things with each other is important, even when it's really hard to do so, even when it's really vulnerable. Yeah, some of those things are helpful in decolonizing your institution or in where you're institutionalized. Yeah, and then the second question was about the financial precariousness, is that right? Or
Yeah.
the tools.
There's, I mean, there's another question on radical governance. What does
Yeah.
radical governance look like for decolonial organizing? Is hierarchy necessary?
Mm. I think it's just so which one should I look at? Should I look at this one in the chat I can see here about non-Western design processes.
Which calls to you?
Sorry?
Which one calls to you?
Um all of them are hard questions. So I think in terms of like non-Western design processes that are utilized in my work, I maybe wouldn't call them processes as such as because I'm not I'm not that process driven as a person. I thought I was, but then I started working with people and realized that actually I just sort of figure stuff out based on like what's going on. Um, but like some of the things that I have been looking into, well, one of the texts that I, like was really useful for me early on was like Ezio Mancini's Design When Everybody Designs, and some of the way he frames like this diffuse design and like your role as a professional designer and working with people who are maybe just accessing their design abilities and capabilities and drawing those out. Um, and yeah, things are not like necessarily flowing to mind in terms of like some of these approaches, but I was following, there's a organization called, there's a design agency called Pause and Effect based in Canada, and they put out some really good stuff about relational design and decolonizing the design practices. So I've been reading some of their stuff as well. Um, yeah, so that's a few things that come to mind right now.
Amazing. And I think we can't forget our own lived experiences. And like you were saying, what we embody, all those lineages, the way that we do things will, even if we can't articulate it,
Yeah,
we do things in a different way. um, and that trusting that intuition, trusting ourselves and the ways in which things can be done that
mm,
feel more comfortable to us, that feel more accessible to us, that feel like you can invite your auntie to it.
yeah,
That is part of colonizing ourselves and the environments we're part of.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah, for real.
it is 2 past 2, and I think people started to leave.
Mhm.
So I think, unfortunately, we need to close this conversation, even though we had lots of other questions to ask you. But thank you for being so generous and comprehensive and open about how you're thinking about applying your skills, what design can do, and how you're sustaining this like amazingly ambitious experiment, which is Civic Square. Yeah, it's been a real treat chatting to you. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope it was useful. Yeah, I can see from the comments people are like, yeah.
Normal. Nice.
And yeah, maybe we'll grab some of the links that you mentioned,
Yeah,
um, and we'll send it out to everyone. Yay, feeling inspired. So
amazing.
simple. Yeah. And thank you, Becca, for holding us.